Namaskar to everyone. I'm Radhika, representing Voices from the Periphery, and it is both a profound privilege and an honor of the highest order to welcome you all to today's much anticipated lecture titled Reorienting the Global Muslim Women's Travel Writing Over 3 Centuries. This evening holds particular significance for us as we are joined by one of the most distinguished scholars in this field, Professor Siobhan Lambert-Hurley. Professor Lambert-Hurley is a preeminent historian and currently serves as Professor of Global History at the University of Sheffield. Her scholarship has been pivotal in shaping our understanding of gender, autobiography, and the lived experiences of Muslim women, particularly in South Asia. Her work insightfully traverses the intricate intersections of personal narrative, cultural identity, and historical context, bringing to light the complex and often overlooked dimensions of Muslim women's lives across centuries. Her intellectual trajectory is marked by an unwavering commitment to amplifying marginalized voices through rigorous archival research and interdisciplinary approaches. Her landmark publication, Elusive Lives, Gender Autobiography, and the Self in Muslim South Asia, masterfully unpacks the layered complexities of self-representation among Muslim women, drawing from an extraordinary corpus of autobiographical texts across multiple languages. This seminal text, alongside other foundational works such as Atiya's Journeys, A Muslim Woman from Colonial Bombay to Edwardian Britain, and Muslim Women, Reform and Princely Patronage, Nawab Sultan Jahan Begum of Bhopal, collectively underscores her scholarly dedication to unearthing the intimate and political narratives that have historically shaped women's subjectivities in the region. Beyond her published works, Professor Lambert-Hurley has led several impactful research initiatives, notably the Arts and Humanities Research Council-funded project, Forgotten Food, Culinary Memory, Local Heritage and Lost Agricultural Varieties in India, a path-breaking inquiry into cultural memory and heritage. She has also co-edited influential volumes such as Speaking of the Self, Gender, Performance and Autobiography in South Asia, exemplifying her commitment to collaborative, cross-disciplinary scholarship. Equally commendable is her engagement beyond academia. Through initiatives like Accessing Muslim Lives, Professor Lambert-Hurley has worked tirelessly to digitize and disseminate autobiographical writings, making them more accessible to scholars and the broader public alike. Her work not only deepens our historical consciousness, but also challenges dominant narratives by foregrounding the voices, agency, and cultural expressions of Muslim women across time and space. In essence, the contributions of Professor Lambert-Hurley to the fields of global history, gender studies, and Muslim women's writing are marked by intellectual brilliance, methodological innovation, and a deeply humanistic vision. Please join me in extending a warm and respectful welcome to Professor Siobhan Lambert-Hurley. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Radhika, for that really warm and indeed generous introduction to my talk today. I really appreciate your kind words. So I'm going to be focusing my talk today on a book that was published quite recently with Zuban in Delhi. And I'm just going to hold up the copy here, though I'm going to show my slides in a minute where there's a picture of it as well. And so I'm going to be drawing on that book to, as I say, make some general points around my theme, which is reorienting the global. So let me just share these slides now, and we can go from there. I should say too that it is a real pleasure to be invited to give this talk today. So a big thank you to those behind this series of talks on Voices from the Periphery for their invitation today and the opportunity to speak. So I would like to start today by reading you an excerpt from one chapter in this book. And this is a translation from Farsi of part of a travel narrative that was written by a woman who may be familiar to at least some of you. And this is the figure that you now see on your screen, which is the Iranian feminist, Sadiqe Dolatabadi. This woman lived and worked in the first half of the 20th century. The picture that I've shown you here is actually a picture that was taken of her during her trip. And you see here, I've also provided her dates. So we can see that she was living and active really in the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, this woman traveled from Iran for the first time in 1923, at which point she was in her early 40s. And she didn't actually write a fully fledged travelogue, but instead captured...
One minute, if I may interrupt, the slides are actually not visible.
Oh, that's frustrating.
It is indeed.
Let me go back. There we go. I think I had put it on and then it came off again. Now
Yes,
we've got them. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm glad that you interrupted me. Otherwise, I would have been talking about pictures and you wouldn't have been able to see any of them. So yes, let me just go back. I will make sure that they are the entire shows. Okay, so that was my opening slide, and there. Can you see them now, Radhika?
Yes, ma'am, we can see them now.
Perfect, excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So now you can see the figure that I was speaking about, which is the Iranian feminist Sadiqa. As it says here on the slide, we see here a picture of her with two other women at a party in Paris in the late 1920s, which was the first time that she had actually traveled out of Iran. And by this point, as I noted already, she was in her early 40s. Her travel writing isn't captured in a book, but instead in a series of articles and letters that were published in various Persian newspapers. And I want to quote from one of those now that was only published quite some years later in 1945, so many years after her journey, and it was published in a newspaper that she herself edited. And as I read this, I think you'll notice that she uses dialogue to very interesting effect. So it captures a long exchange that she had with a French immigration officer when she arrived at Marseille in 1923. So she writes, "Here is my passport. Are you Iranian? You must certainly be Armenian Iranian, isn't it? I am Iranian, but not Armenian. You can't be Muslim. Perhaps you are Jewish. No, sir, I am not Jewish. Not only have my ancestors been of Muslim and Iranian origin for generations, but my father was one of the Muslim jurists of his time. I can't believe that I'm facing a Muslim and an Iranian woman. Now tell me, with whom have you come all this way? I mean, who has brought you? I traveled alone, but God was with me everywhere." The official made a gesture of surprise. My God, mon Dieu, a Muslim Iranian woman has traveled alone from Tehran to France. How did your government permit you to leave? Where did you get this passport? And the exchange goes on from there. Now, I wanted to start with this exchange, which is, I should say, translated in full in the book, because I think it really captures, I suppose, many assumptions about Muslim women travelers, not just in the past, but perhaps now too. Perhaps an assumption that because of the constraints on women's mobility in Islam, that Muslim women simply aren't travelers, and that if they are, they face all kinds of specific challenges. The need for a male guardian, as we see in this extract, the difficulties of making travel work with practices of veiling and seclusion, something I think is also implicit here, perhaps the difficulties of accessing halal food, and many other problems besides. Now, whatever our backgrounds, I think it's not surprising that these assumptions may be floating about, partly because they reaffirm certain colonial or Orientalist suppositions that, of course, remain alive and well in the present, and partly because very few people have access to the historical record about Muslim women's mobility in the past beyond a few specialists. So that was really the thinking behind this book. It was about making that historical record available to a much bigger audience, specifically by gathering, translating, and contextualizing travel writings that were written by Muslim women over 3 centuries. And I think you'll see there's a real emphasis here on capturing women's own voices from the periphery in the language of this series. And I guess what we're going to see, I'm going to share many of them with you today, and we'll see how many of these voices kind of belie many of our assumptions, even as they affirm or inflect others. So what I want to do in my talk today is kind of 2 main things. First of all, I want to introduce you to this collection. I want to tell you a little bit about what it looks like and what it aims to do, and really the kind of methodological considerations that underpin it. And I guess that I'm hoping that will lead us to think about how we recover these kinds of voices from the periphery. And then, having introduced the collection, I then want to turn to its broader significance to history, especially in terms of, in the words of my title, reorienting the global. So to ask, how does opening up these kinds of historical sources, these voices from the periphery with their gendered subjectivities, how does that help us deepen our understanding of a global past? I should say that as I present the material today, I'm going to try and intersperse it with plenty of quotations from the book. And I hope this will really give you a kind of sense of the flavor of the materials here. I do so, of course, there's the overview of my sections today. I do so with appropriate thanks to my collaborators on this project. So you'll note that the book was edited with two other scholars, Sunil Sharma and Daniel Makrovitz, who you see on the slide, as well as many contributors. And indeed, I'm going to be quoting from chapters that were prepared by a large team of regional specialists, including Daniel, Sunil, and myself, as well as for today's presentation, the three that you see at the bottom here, Roberta Mikhailov, Asya Al-Aslam, and Norton Kilit Shubal. I should say, too, that the book covers all parts of the Muslim world, but I'm going to be focusing primarily, at least, on material from India in reflection of our audience, I think, today, but also my own specialism. But I will be bringing in a few other examples, too. So let me start by introducing the collection. The first point to make is that it starts inevitably, as any academic work, with a fairly lengthy introduction, which I'm going to be drawing on for my talk today. And then, as you can see from this table of contents, the book has the chapters of 45 women travelers, each of whom wrote about their own experience. So each chapter is actually named for a particular woman. And within those 45 chapters, you can see that the book is divided into 4 different thematic sections. And the way we decided to organize it was to highlight the different motivations to travel that were identified by the authors themselves. So I think you can see the way that we've really tried to take the lead here from those whose voices we seek to recover. The first and slightly longest chapter, or section, I should say, focuses on travel as pilgrimage. And this is perhaps not surprising, being that religious pilgrimage was, as we put it in the introduction, the longest, most consistent, and best accepted type of travel by women. And here we look at different types of pilgrimage. We look at Hajj, of course, pilgrimage to Mecca, but we also look at pilgrimages to Shia holy sites and also visits to Sufi shrines. The second section then focuses on what was to become a major impetus for women to travel from the 19th century. So as we call this section, Travel as Emancipation and Politics. And I should note that the political impetuses to travel here, whether they be individually or on government assignment or as part of some kind of delegations, were very wide. So this is a book about women's writing, and many of these women were inspired by kind of feminist ideals in its broadest implication. But they were also often nationalists, internationalists, and even communists. The third section you'll see is then called Travel as Education. This reflects how Muslim women began writing about their experiences of what we would now call study abroad from the early 20th century. And this might be either formal or informal learning. Some of them took part in training programs, some were enrolled in university courses, others were in other kinds of educational schemes. The final section is then called Travel for Obligation and Pleasure. And this reflects that for many authors, travel was about commitments to their family. So it was about kind of recreating, if you like, the family ideal, the patriarchal family ideal when abroad, by accompanying fathers, brothers, and husbands as they traveled into exile, perhaps for work or study, or especially as time moved on, so from the early 20th century, for recreation as well. Now, we've obviously taken some liberty in placing authors in one section or another. I said that these are organized by motivations, but of course motivations can be both public and private. They can be multiple as well. And so we can see that, for instance, when people went on Hajj, that could often be as much about politics as it could piety. One other thing that's worth noting, I think, is that a kind of unexpected outcome of this thematic organization is that we came to realize that travel writing had certain somewhat kind of peculiar regional specificities. So if you look through the names, you might note that we actually found no Arab or Southeast Asian pilgrimage narratives from before 1950, while all of our Arab and Turkish texts pretty much fell into part 2 on emancipation in politics. We also came to realize that there was way more travel writing being produced in this period in South Asia than anywhere else. If we turn to looking at the actual chapters within each section, maybe I'll just specify 2 that they're all kind of follow a similar format. So each chapter has 2 main parts. It has an introduction, which provides some biographical information about the author, as well as historical and literary context for her travel and travel writing, and some textual analysis. So these are kind of like mini research papers, if you like, in their own right. And then the biggest chunk of each chapter is dedicated to excerpts from a woman's writing, all of which has been translated, usually for the first time, by one of 10 different languages. So this book translates material from Urdu, from Persian, Arabic, Turkish, Bengali, Punjabi, Chagatai Turkish, Indonesian, English, and also German. So as I said at the beginning, you can really see the focus that we have here on capturing women's own voices. Each chapter is then rounded off with a short list of further reading, which also links to our project website, which Radhika kindly referred to at the beginning as well. You see a quick screenshot of it here. It's called Accessing Muslim Lives. And here you can find supplementary materials in digital form, including additional translations, original texts, and visual sources. And we hope that this gives some kind of transparency to the process of translation. For most of the material, we do include here access to the original texts. So those who have the facility to read these texts in their original languages may do so here. Perhaps this is a good moment to note, too, that the materials that we include in this book are often very rare, perhaps now existing only in a single copy. Very often they're found in quite obscure and inaccessible locations. So as we put it in the introduction, this really is and I quote, bounty of newly discovered writing, much of which has even been lost to the literary traditions out of which it grew. So some of these texts maybe were quite well known in their own time, but as the kind of corpus has developed over time, many of them have been lost or forgotten. And I think a nice example is the text that you see on the left here, which is a Hajj narrative in poetry by a woman called Nur Begum. Nur Begum was fairly well known as a writer in her own time in the 1930s. But by the time we were looking for these texts, my colleague Daniel Makovitz, he was only able to find this single copy in a rare collection in rural Punjab in Pakistan. So it gives a sense, I think, of the detective work that goes in to kind of recovering these voices and why it also took many years to put it together. Of course, we certainly don't claim to have found everything. There's only 45 chapters, and indeed, even as we were finishing the book, we kept finding more and more texts. So for those of you who are looking to do more work in the future, I hope this will be an opening to that and will inspire you to go on and investigate further in this area. Now, the writers that we do include here, or the writings, I should say, that we do include here, do span, as I said in my title, a period of 3 centuries. So the earliest work is from the 17th century. We go right up to the mid-20th century. We had to choose a kind of somewhat arbitrary cutoff point, and that is the transformative arrival of the jet engine on transatlantic commercial routes in 1958. We chose this as our cutting point because we felt that it brought so many changes by sort of speeding up the process of travel, if you like. It changed how and why women traveled. And we also see with changes in publishing that travel as a genre really kind of shifts in the late 20th century. So it changes why women wrote about it as well. I've probably made it clear already that all of our authors are female. But they are incredibly diverse. As we put it in our introduction, they take in, and I quote, queens, reformers, pilgrims, Sufis, wives, converts, captors, planners, literateurs, and provocateurs. And just to give you a kind of sense of the range of women that are covered in this book, I've just given you some images of a few of them here on the slide. These are all images that are reproduced in the book as well. And maybe I'll just highlight a few of them who actually came from South Asia, or colonial India primarily. So you'll note in the top left-hand corner of my slide, there's a picture of a woman called Begum Shaista Ikramullah with her 3 children. This photo was taken when she traveled with her husband, who was a colonial officer, and they traveled to London in the late 1930s, where I believe the youngest of them, you see here, the little one on her lap, was actually born. Underneath that, in the bottom left-hand corner, you see the figure of Sharifa Hamid Ali, who represented India to the United Nations, particularly the Commission on the Status of Women in the late 1940s. This picture was actually taken when she was a representative there in 1946. If we go up to the top right-hand corner, this picture accompanies a chapter on a woman called Maimuna Sultan Shah Bano Begum, who was the wife of the Nawab of Bhopal. So you see...
I'm very sorry to interrupt you again, but I think the slides might be stuck because...
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we've kind of been looking at slide number 2. Yeah, now we can see.
Okay.
Okay, this is fine now. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, I keep interrupting you.
No, not at all. I'm not quite sure why they're not working so well today. Would you like me just to leave them in that form?
This is fine.
Okay, rather than share the whole screen?
If it gets stuck again, I'll let you know.
Okay, fine. Okay, so I was just talking about this picture in the top right-hand corner here. And that's a picture of the Nawab of Bhopal, Nawab Hamidullah Khan, with his family, including his wife and 3 daughters in London, again in the 1930s. As I said, the chapter this accompanies is a chapter where we see the travel writings of his wife, who was next to him, Maimuna Sultan Shah Bano Begum. And then in the middle, at the bottom, this is one of my favorite chapters. You see here a couple pushing a pram in Oxford in the 1930s. And this is a woman called Mohammadi Begum, who came from Hyderabad to study at the University of Oxford at that time. So these are just a few examples of some of the figures in this book. Maybe a point worth making is that the authors are equally diverse in terms of their origins and also in terms of their destinations. So our authors hail from many locations in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, and they really crisscross the globe. So they weren't limited in any way by a kind of imperial journey, if you like, between metropole and colony. So hopefully you'll be able to see these slides as I go, because I'm just going to flip through a few and just introduce you to some of the different journeys that are captured. This one actually captures Egyptians who traveled through India. And this is exemplified by the woman you see on the screen, hopefully, the feminist Amina Said. She wrote an Arabic travel account in 1946, which translates as Observations from India. Another example is of Turks in Finland. And that includes this woman here's very kind of dreamlike account of visiting Helsinki in 1932. We also have Iranians in South Africa. This is specifically Shams Pahlavi, the daughter of Reza Shah Pahlavi, who went into exile with her father after his abdication in 1941. We then have a lovely little group of Indonesians, travelers, including the ones you see here. I think particularly of Nyonya Olia Salim, who accompanied her doctor husband on a tour of American medical facilities in the early 1950s. And then on the right of the screen here, you see Suharti Suwarto, who went on a sponsored trip to the Soviet Union to observe technical and social advances there in 1954. The next slide includes two figures who wrote in European languages. So on the left, we have Salama bint Said, who was later known as Emily Reuter, who wrote in German. And she was actually a princess of Oman and Zanzibar who fled to Germany with her lover in 1866. And then at the top, or the right-hand side, I should say, we have the aristocratic British convert, Zainab, formerly Evelyn Cobbold, who was styled in the British newspapers of the time as the first English woman to go on Hajj, or pilgrimage to Mecca in 1933. And then, as I said, we have an inordinate number of South Asian travelers who traveled to all different places, to Arabia, the Levant, Egypt, Turkey, Iran, Britain, France, Germany, the United States, and many places before. And you'll recognize some of those pictures that I showed before, but there's two others there. Maybe I'll just point out. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the veiled figure of Nawab Sultan Jahan Begum of Bhopal, the last ruling Begum of Bhopal, who went on Hajj in the very early part of the 20th century, but also traveled to Europe and the Middle East twice. And then in the middle top, we have this lovely family picture, which accompanies the chapter on Begum Inam Habibullah, who traveled to visit her sons who were at boarding school. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about her in a minute, in the early 20s. Now, unfortunately, for all this variety, few of our authors really disrupt the association between travel and privilege, particularly because this is, of course, a book of travel writing, and that means there was a requirement for literacy. And in India in 1901, for instance, that literacy was less than 1% among women. So that means that most of our authors were privileged and often highly so. But what's interesting, I think, about their accounts is they did write about a very wide array of women, so women from all different socioeconomic backgrounds. And then a few of our authors did also have more kind of modest backgrounds. So I thought I'd just point to one example here, which is the example of Dilshad. Dilshad was the author of A History of Immigrants, a sample page of which you see here. She calls it that because she was actually forcibly deported as a prisoner of war from her city of birth in what is now Tajikistan in the Kokand Khanate in around 1870 at the age of 17. She came from a very modest background. She'd been orphaned as a child, and she then had been raised by her grandmother, who made a very simple living from spinning. She was later married off to an aging imam at a local mosque and became a teacher. She was trained by his mother, who was the one who, of course, gave her literacy. And I thought I'd just read you out a little quote from Dilshad's chapter. This is an extract that's translated from the original Persian, though she also wrote her account in Chagatai Turki too. And here she really recounts how she became a quote-unquote immigrant and also points to her very humble social background. So she writes, in the autumn of year 1816, at the time when ordinary people were returning to the city from their orchards and were busy repairing and fortifying their houses, the Battle of Amir Omar Khan began. This had created fear and panic among the people. My mother had died 3 years earlier during the plague, and as for my father, he had died in battle. From our household, only I and my 90-year-old grandmother were left alive, making a living by spinning. In this 6-day-long battle, all of the men of the city were busy waging war in the streets and the city square, while the elderly and the women and children were hiding in their homes or in large cauldrons. The horror of the war spread everywhere. Suddenly, the invading army, after launching another attack, entered the city. The invading soldiers, along with the guards and intimates of the Amir, went from house to house, looting and plundering people's goods and possessions and taking their daughters. And this was also how the author herself was taken and ended up, as I noted already, in a different city. Now, I think this is quite an interesting extract because we see how, and I quote this chapter's introduction, this author is really claiming her voice as that of the common and ordinary people, and how she's really seeking to register their lives in her work. So we can really see how this is a text that is really kind of grabbing those voices from the periphery and inscribing them into texts. Now, whatever their social status, most of the authors in this book actually consciously identified as Muslim, and very often use their travel writings to kind of meaningly engage with what that meant. Sometimes that was from a religious perspective, sometimes it was more kind of social or cultural in its perspective. And I guess what we find, as the women travelers themselves found, was that there was definitely no single perspective or experience that adhered to the idea of the Muslim woman. Perhaps inevitably the positionality of our authors was determined not just by their gender and creed, but as often and often principally by other factors. So perhaps by their cultural background, race, class, politics, and of course just who they were as individuals too. Also notable, I think, that these authors only often found their own ideas of community and Islamic practice very much challenged by the experience of travel. So one thing we see in the Hajj narratives, for instance, is that many of these women went on Hajj expecting themselves to kind of feel connected to other Muslims, to be enveloped by this really kind of strong sense of belonging to the Ummah or a universal Muslim community. But on the contrary, they often experienced the opposite. So they often found the experience of being kind of butted up against other Muslims, whether from their own region or area or from elsewhere, whether it be on the Hajj ship or in the Hijaz itself, that often had an opposite effect. In other words, it often kind of reinforced their sense of difference, a sense of their own separate national, ethnic, or status identities. Sometimes they went kind of thinking, oh, I'm going to understand what true Islam is, but actually they came away feeling really the value of their own local practices. And I thought I might offer you a quote here from perhaps one of my favorite authors in the whole book, which is a woman called Rahil Begum Shabania. She was from a prominent and accomplished family associated with Aligarh modernism in India, who traveled on Hajj in 1923, but only published her narrative a few years later in 1929. Sadly, we don't have a picture of her, but we have represented her here by her final resting place, which you see in the bottom right-hand corner. And one of the reasons I love this text so much is because she's very focused on food. And I'm currently working, as was noted at the beginning, on a project on food. And so we see how she really uses food to kind of distinguish between the Indian Muslims aboard a Hajj ship and the Meccan Muslims they were going to visit. This is, again, a text that captures dialogue between the author and, in this case, one of her fellow first-class passengers, who was another woman aboard the ship. So she says, I asked her what sort of disaster she was expecting that she would bring so many supplies with her. She replied, Sister, we wouldn't be able to bear eating Mecca Sharif's stinking ghee or clarified butter for a single day. Why? Aren't the residents of Mecca human too? Human or not, everyone has their own habits and tastes. We'd rather eat boiled food than their ghee. Even if we have to go without food for 4 days, we won't put their ghee in our mouths. To which I replied, well, then you yourself should take my canister of ghee. I will eat that sticky, rotten ghee instead. She said, the wheat there is so bad that it clogs up your intestines, and proceeded to trash every single grain in Mecca Sharif. There were about 12 women there, each of whom took a turn to sing the highest praises of the items that they had brought with them, and to try and scare me by impressing upon me my impending suffering. And so I particularly like this because we can see how she's going on Hajj. She's going to what is sort of seen as the center, if you like, of Islamic practice. And yet there's this real sort of sense of confidence, if you like, in one's own food and cultural practice. And what's perhaps just as interesting is that she was equally as vicious to other Indian Muslims with whom she traveled, particularly if they came from other status groups or regions within India. So at one stage, she says of Bengalis and Biharis in particular, may God never ask us to travel with them again. So we really get a sense of how this woman is producing this engaging but also very acerbic and astute narrative. And it really, I think, points to the fact how our book is very much a kind of mediation, if you like, on the inherent diversity of Islam. There's just so many experiences captured in this book, and so few of them overlap, that their mere juxtaposition, both within individual narratives, as we see here, and between them, is really a kind of potent reminder to us always of how Islam as a category can be as limiting as it is enabling. Now, I should note that this quality of diversity within Islam has really informed our choosing of extracts. So we've tended to focus, as these women themselves did, on their experiences of other women. So those were sometimes other Muslim women, but not exclusively so. So this is really a book that really focuses on kind of social interactions between women across cultural and linguistic boundaries. There are, of course, innumerable examples of this in the book in every chapter, but I thought I'd just draw out one from a chapter on a woman called Begum Sarbulan Jung, who may be familiar. Oh, sorry, I've just lost her. There she is. She was the wife of the Chief Justice of Hyderabad at the time of her trip to Damascus in 1909. And her book, which actually wasn't published till several decades later, was entitled Dunya Aurat Ki Nazar Mein, The World as Seen by a Woman. And I think the title really points out to how she's very kind of explicit in this idea that her perspective is valuable, her perspective is important, because she's actually offering a woman's take on women's lives. Wonderfully, we have just an extract from this book in our collection, but the whole book has been published recently in translation by one of my co-editors, by Daniel Makovets. I've just included an image of that book at the top there. It's called A Journey to Mecca and London, and that's just come out with Indiana University Press in 2025. Now, this couple, Begum Sarbulan Jung and her husband, were quite different from the woman I talked about before, Rahil Begum Shavania, in that they were very inspired, I would say, by a kind of pan-Islamic ideal. So they were really intent on underplaying ethnic or regional differences between Muslims. So as Daniel has pointed out in much of his work, she was consciously kind of seeking out this idea that there was a Muslim sisterhood, that she had a connection to other Muslim women, and she sought that through her travels. But what she found was this was always being challenged as she kind of was faced with linguistic and cultural difference. So Begum Sarbulan Jung had actually tried to learn Arabic before she left, and she includes Arabic speech in her account. It was, as Daniel's described it, functional but broken, as we try to indicate. So I thought I'd just kind of exemplify this this longing but also challenge that she experienced by reading you a wonderful passage that comes from a section entitled "Everyone's Naked in the Bathhouse." So she says, "The two of us," by which she means herself and her husband, "set out from the hotel, and we found two hammams nearby, one for men, the other for women. I knocked on the door, and a woman appeared from inside. When she saw me, she said, 'Welcome, come in, come in.' I agreed and went inside, where I saw 30 or 40 women gathered. I paused, thinking to myself that I was quite in a dilemma. I'll wait to begin my bath, I thought, until everyone else is finished. I was standing there waiting when a woman came up to me, took the bag from my hand, and began to remove my clothes. I said, 'Wait, wait,' and she retorted, 'No hurry,' and said God knows what else in Arabic. I went silent when I saw that she had no intention of listening to me. She took off all of my clothes. I wrapped myself up in a towel, and she took me by the hand and led me away. When I stepped foot into the next room, oh, my feet were immediately burned. I said, 'Hey, you tyrant, hang on, my feet are burning.' But she kept on dragging me, saying, 'Come on, come inside.' The woman began to rub my body, washing me. In fact, 3 or 4 of the women stopped bathing themselves and coming over to me began to scrub me as well. In Arabic, they asked me, 'Who are you? Where are you from?' I said to them, 'I am Indian. In India, the hammam is at home. But here I saw the hammam is in the town. In the home, there is none. I am astonished.' These women washed me more thoroughly than I'd ever been washed in my entire life. Here I am in this huge rush to leave, and they kept on pouring out more and more water. At last, I managed to escape them. I wrapped that same wet towel around myself so I would not be entirely naked when I exited the hammam, but all of them called out to me saying, 'Hey, sister, there are only women here.' I said, yes, but I still need a towel. I began to leave, but they took hold of me, saying, don't go, sit down, just for a while more. I replied, I don't wait. I am in a hurry. Husband at door. And they reluctantly released me. So we really get a sense here, I think, of this kind of sense of how she wants to be part of what's going on, but at the same time, she's not feeling the sisterhood, as it were. Now, this narrative was actually written in the form of a daily diary. This particular excerpt was dated 7th of December 1909. And I guess that really encourages me to make a point about kind of nomenclature and form as well. So you'll notice that we very consciously use the term travel writing for this book rather than travelogue. And we do this very purposely to enable the inclusion of a much more expansive set of materials in this collection, which in turn enables us, I think, to capture more voices. Indeed, we really found that the forms women chose or had access to were often gendered. So men were much more likely to write your kind of typical travelogue, while women were always sort of responding to the circumstances to find other ways to write about travel. So some of the authors do prepare what we might instinctively think of as a travelogue, even if they're somewhat more kind of quotidian in focus, while others are often excerpted from autobiographical writings or take the form of magazine articles. Some of the material we have here started as private letters or diary entries. A couple come from public lectures. I think I noted already that some of them were written in the form of poetry or rhyming couplets. And I guess what that means is that most of the material we look at here really, rather than kind of, I guess, responding to a more colonial epistemology of trying to kind of fit with a colonial model, if you like, they fit much more closely with what we've called the reigning literary aesthetics of the cultures out of which they came. So I guess kind of thinking about that methodology of recovering these voices, it's being creative, I suppose, in terms of where one's looking. Now, I noted at the start that I also, in this paper, wanted to highlight some of the kind of, I guess, intellectual contributions of a collection of this sort, which above all seeks to, as we put it, integrate gendered subjectivities into a deepened understanding of our global past. And I guess the first point to make here is that a collection of this sort, I really hope, starts to make available to different types of history, to global, international, and imperial histories, a type of historical source that's rarely been employed in their service. So one of the critiques that we've seen of global history in recent years, and I'm thinking here of Jeremy Adelman's Provocation, for those of you who are familiar with that literature, is that they've described global history as, and I quote, another Anglospheric invention to integrate the other into a cosmopolitan narrative on our terms in our tongues. So it's kind of highlighting, I suppose, that global history, because of its border crossing features, really always kind of falls back on materials in English particularly, and it then shares those materials in English too. Of course, I'm fully aware that a book of translation isn't the perfect antidote here, but I think in making these writings, which all, well, not all, but most of which appeared in other languages initially, and making those available, hopefully at least opens up the historian with globalizing ambitions to kind of what they're missing, to the fact that there is a lot of this material in local languages, which really gives us insight, I guess, into global processes. And not only does it give us insight, I think it also really nuances our understanding of those global processes. So another critique that we've seen of global history is that it's often full of, and I quote, do-good storytelling, emphasizing our cosmopolitan commonness. So suggesting that if people are in motion, if people are crossing boundaries and are meeting other people, that somehow that is kind of creating this connected global world. And it says that that I guess understanding is kind of what am I trying to say? It's focusing on the motion rather than focusing on those that were staying at home, if you like, and were therefore perhaps more wedded to more local identities. But I guess what I'm trying to point out, and maybe this is evident from the quotes that I've already shared, is that really these categories are far from dichotomous. So people might be in motion, and they might be connecting, but that doesn't mean they're sharing, if you like. And when you're in motion, you might still, if you like, herald exclusion. So some of the authors in our collection really kind of reveled in the Muslim solidarity that they experience on Hajj, for example. And I thought I might just give you a quick example here from the account of a woman called Kesri Begum, who was the granddaughter of the well-known Urdu language novelist Deputy Nazir Ahmed. And she wrote about her Hajj in 1936. And her account is just full of this kind of sheer joy of praying with those of all nations and colors, of those who are rich and poor, male and female, on equal footing before the holy Kaaba. And I think we get a bit of a taste of that in this following passage. She writes, Alhamdulillah, after my arrival in Mecca, I was blessed with the opportunity to offer my Friday prayers in the sacred Kaaba. May God accept them. I was also able to spend an evening there, so I could see how it was at this time of day. I thought that I might be able to do my worship and circumambulations more easily at that hour, but oh no, I ended up seeing the same multitude at night as I did in the day. I pressed my back against a wall for a moment and then stepped forward into the crowd. All my fatigue evaporated. Day no longer felt like night. Day no longer felt like day. Night was no longer night. Every second was as luminous as though it were high noon. So we can really see, as I said, this joy, this coming together of people. At the same time, probably pretty obvious from the two excerpts that I read already from Rahil Begum and also Begum Sarbalanjang, that even when people were looking for commonality, as in Begum Sarbalanjang's case, that sometimes that sense of commonness never came. I've given you a number of examples that relate to Hajj here, but I think we can see that women who traveled from colonized territories to Europe reacted with equal ambivalence to the connections that were facilitated by motion. So some of the authors here really point to both the ostracism and racial abuse that, and in doing so, really paralleled the experiences of male travelers. Others forged quite important friendships across the strict binaries of West and East, colonizer and colonized. And actually, I think we can see a sort of gender difference here in that for men, they most often faced kind of racism and ostracism, but for elite women, at least, they more often were faced with curiosity. That seemed to be more the norm for them. And I might note here, point here to a quite charming passage, I think, which is in the account of Safia Jabir Ali, who traveled around Britain just after the First World War with her husband. He had, I skipped over a slide, actually. There's the figure that I was just talking about. And then here is Safia Jabir Ali. This is a wonderful picture, I think. It's of her with her family in Burma, and that was where her husband, Jabir, who was also in this picture, actually had a hardware business. And so he goes to London, or Britain generally, right after the First World War. And because he's looking for kind of business contacts, it means that they do this like crazy journey that takes them off all the kind of usual tourist haunts. So in the extract I want to read you, she's actually visiting Rosyth Naval Dockyard on the Firth of Forth in Fife in Scotland. And she writes, I must tell you of an incident that amused us very much. When we were waiting at the little Rosyth tramway station, near which were a number of cottages, we noticed a group of chubby little children playing about. But I was fairly taken by surprise, and a very agreeable surprise too, when one of them came up to me shyly with a few flowers plucked from his garden, and addressing me as lady, presented me with them. I thought how considerate and kind it was of him, and I thanked him and said so. A little later, 2 or 3 others came along, and then some more, and I had to repeat my thanks and accept their offerings. Turning round, I saw these children run with smiles on their lips to a group collected not far from us, and by the eager way in which they immediately began to talk, and the interest of their listeners, together with the curious glances they shot at us, I was able to guess all that lay behind their minds. They had wanted to know what a coloured lady, and I should notice this is her term, would do when she was given flowers, for instance. Would she speak? And if she did, in what language? Also, I suppose they desired to get a nearer view of the strange specimen of humanity before them. Anyway, we had a good laugh over it and enjoyed their little enterprise very much. So I think we see from this how this woman was really faced with this curiosity of these children, and rather than being offended by it, she, as she says, has a good laugh over it. Of course, British curiosity was not always received with equanimity. And I might point here to another of my favorite chapters, which is the chapter by a woman I mentioned earlier, the figure of Begum Inam Habibullah, who was from a talukdari or landlord background in the United Provinces. And I think I noted already that she visited Britain with her husband and young daughter in 1924 to meet her 3 sons, who you see at the back of this picture, who were all at boarding school in Dorset. And she writes, I won't read the whole extract now because I feel like I've been talking for quite a long time, but she talks about them eating out a meal in a London restaurant. And she complains about the fact that it's supposed to be rude to stare in Britain, but the whole time she can feel everybody's eyes upon her. And she comments how she finds this like incredibly uncomfortable. And then she goes on to complain about the food as well. So again, we see this kind of cultural confidence, if you like. Maybe I will just read this bit because it is quite interesting. She says, and the food, I think, can't but taste bad to a Hindustani. I can make this conjecture, for when I was in India, I was accustomed to eating English food regularly. But to be honest, since coming here, I've grown to detest it. So I think we can see from these kind of complaints about British cuisine that travel very often led to this sort of sense of cultural entrenchment rather than any kind of vaunted open-mindedness. She wasn't kind of suddenly having her eyes open to the world around. Indeed, a very lengthy stay in early 20th century Europe or North America often confirmed for many Muslim female travelers that so-called Western culture and society simply didn't live up to its billing. And I'd just like to share a last quote with you here, which actually comes from one of the more famous authors in our collection, a Turkish author called Zeynep Hanum, who, writing from London in 1908-9, spoke of the mirage of the West. And I think this is a nice example to finish with because it really gives us a sense of how these so-called voices from the periphery are kind of writing back to power, if you like. So she writes, it seems to me that we Orientals are, that's her term, we Orientals are children to whom fairy tales have been told for far too long, fairy tales that have every appearance of truth. You hear so much of the mirage of the East, but what is that compared to the mirage of the West to which all Orientals are attached? They tell you fairy tales too, you women of the West, fairy tales that, like ours, have all the appearance of truth. I wonder, when the English women have really won their vote and the right to exercise all the tiring professions of men, what will they have gained? Their faces will be a little sadder, a little more weary, and they will have become wholly disillusioned. So we can see here how she's reflecting, particularly, she's there at the height of the suffragette movement, and she's reflecting on the kind of long-term effects of these women's rights movements in a way that may be understandable to some of us. Now, what I think the few examples that I provided you to really point to, I suppose, is this kind of complex renegotiation of global geographies that are required by these travel writings. Too often we get kind of stuck, I think, in this recurring Victorian metaphor of the voyage out, suggesting that there's this kind of one-way traffic, if you like, between imperial core and colonial periphery. And indeed, the whole time I was working on this project, people kept saying to me, what are you working on now? And I would say, oh, I'm working on women travelers. And everybody assumed that I was working on British women who were traveling to, quote unquote, the colonies. But of course I wasn't. I was looking at women, Muslim women, primarily from India, who were traveling elsewhere. And I think if we start kind of following these very convoluted paths of Muslim women travelers, if we start kind of capturing these voices from the periphery, that we begin to really disrupt many of the primary assumptions of Eurocentrism, that somehow people and knowledge and ideas radiate outwards from the West to the rest. And I think to incorporate these kind of perspectives, as we find in this book, into one's scholarship and teaching and broader understanding is really part of the transformation that we all need to go through to, in effect, decolonize history. as we put it in our introduction, these voices really enable us to critically reflect on the privileging and marginalization of certain voices in history, while bringing the past to bear on our contemporary debates about globalization, migration, and decolonization. And I've talked far too long, I'm sure, and I think that's probably a good place to finish, and of course open it up if anyone has any comments or questions. So back to you, Radhika.
Thank you so much, ma'am. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and then unmute yourselves, or you can also put the questions in the chat box right here. We have a question in the message box, ma'am. Will you see it yourself, or should I read it out?
No, I can see it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
I'm just thinking about it as I read it. So you probably recognize that I've taken this term quite consciously from the work of Gunther Frank, who uses this idea of reorienting to think about how we kind of turn these, just what you're talking about, these kind of this epistemic gauge, and how we kind of turn that on its head. Now, Gunther Frank never intended it to have the kind of gendered intention that I'm giving it here. But I think there's still a kind of purpose in doing so. So I suppose I understand the points that you're making, and I understand, and I think those are really important points to make. But at the same time, if we don't make these sources available, and if we don't kind of highlight their importance, then we're not bringing together these different knowledge systems, and we're not enabling these kind of different types of knowledge to kind of speak to one another, I suppose. So I guess I don't see it. You've asked if I see it as a kind of performative reenactment of colonial cartographic power. I don't think I do see it that way, I guess would be the simple answer. But I think it's thinking about how we use these texts and why we're using them. And I think that that motivation is really key to the purpose here, maybe. Yeah. But that's a very thoughtful question, and I will continue to reflect on it. Thank you.
While we wait for other questions in the chat box, there are a few questions that have come in from the YouTube live stream that I talked about earlier. So let me just read one of them out to you. Is there a risk that the contemporary academic gaze, often located in institutions of the global north, transforms these intimate and subversive acts of travel writing into sanitized objects of intellectual consumption, thereby reproducing another layer of epistemic control over the very agency it seeks to recover?
Can you just read the last bit out again? Sorry, you cut out just there.
I'll just ask it again. Is there a risk that the contemporary academic gaze, often located in institutions of the global north, transforms these intimate and subversive acts of travel writing into sanitized objects of intellectual consumption, thereby reproducing another layer of epistemic control over the very agency it seeks to recover?
Yeah, and I think we're kind of pointing to similar questions here that we have in the last one. I mean, first of all, you made this point at the beginning, Radhika, and I would resist this idea of being located in the global north. all of the work that I have done, and I think this work is very much part of that as well, is a collaborative venture. And it's a collaborative venture between scholars in lots of different kind of locations. So I think to kind of see this as sort of a one-way process, I think is sort of problematic. In terms of sanitizing them, I think we've tried to do exactly the opposite, actually. We've really tried to not sanitize them and not kind of remove their subversiveness, but rather continue to use them to that aim, I suppose. And I think, by highlighting these accounts and by drawing them into the public eye, we're really encouraging them to still be subversive, I suppose, and to still kind of resist the epistemic control that is referred to in this question.
Thank you, ma'am. I think there are 2 more questions in the chat box that have just come in.
Oh, sorry, in this chat. Yes, I see here. Cheers. So I'll take Ishika's question first, which is about kind of curating and framing these travel night writings and the idea of kind of reinscribing elite Anglophone or institutionally visible voices. I would question that these are exactly that, I think. I think some of them are, for sure. And I did note that many of these authors are elite authors, but they were certainly not necessarily institutionally visible in their time, particularly, and they certainly weren't necessarily Anglophone. So, most of these authors are writing in local languages for local audiences. Very often they're capturing, not entirely, but sometimes they're capturing an oral discourse. So I noted how some of the materials here are coming from speech. And I do agree that it's very difficult to capture non-literate women's narratives, which are difficult to capture within the archive itself. But I think the archive that we're trying to create here goes beyond a more kind of standard definition of the archive. So I noted that, this was really detective work to piece together these different accounts. Some of them are coming primarily from family collections. Some of them are coming out of women's magazines or women's journals. And some of them are coming from different locations entirely. So I think that really this is part of the process of trying to look beyond the archive, and it's trying to use these accounts to access exactly those voices that you're talking about. Because as I noted, one of the value, I think, of these accounts too is that they, even though they come from a particular perspective, they also highlight lots of other women within these traveling locations. So, many of these women say things like, oh, I was traveling alone, but in fact, they very rarely are traveling alone. They're usually traveling with perhaps a maidservant or some other kind of domestic servant. And it's through reading these texts against the grain that we can actually recover those processes. So it's, I think, in a way we can use them exactly to the aim that you're speaking about here. And I guess the difficulty is that it's very difficult to capture the travel experiences. We speak in the introduction about lots of other women travelers who didn't have the luxury of literacy and didn't have the luxury to write their narratives. But the difficulty is of capturing those for history, isn't it? And particularly when you're talking about, the further back in history we go, so in the 17th or 18th or 19th century. So in a way, this is, I would say, part of that same process, I think. So thank you for that question. The next one.
Ma'am, should I read it out for you? I can do that if it's helpful. May I?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so Ayush's question is, does the attempt to globally curate Muslim women's travel writing across temporal and spatial ruptures risk becoming a meta-narrative of liberal salvage, wherein the post-colonial scholar operating within Eurocentric epistemological frameworks, unconsciously enacts a Foucauldian will to truth that disciplines unruly subaltern subjectivities into coherent archives, thus obliterating the very chaos, silence, and refusal that constitute the radical potential?
Again, another really fascinating question. I suppose, again, we are historians who are always attentive to temporal and spatial rupture. So I think even though we have grouped these together, we're always being very attentive to those exact ruptures that you're referring to here. So throughout the book, I noted how each chapter has its own introduction, where we're very much thinking about the specificities, I think, of those individual accounts. And then at the beginning of each section, there's also an introduction which talks about kind of those different accounts in dialogue with one another. I would question whether I think that we're trying to be attentive to exactly those ruptures that you're speaking about here. In terms of the chaos, silence, and refusal that constitute their radical potential, I guess I would question how, if we don't make them visible, if we don't draw out those accounts and let them be seen and let them be heard, is the potential even there? They just become lost, don't they? And so I guess it's not about disciplining those subjectivities, but it's about kind of drawing them out and recognizing that unruliness and those subjectivities at the same time. So yeah, I guess making that visible. And I think, everything I tried to emphasize in this talk today was that even though we bring them together in a book, that this isn't necessarily coherent. We're not, everything that we look at in these sources is to highlight the variability, I suppose, within them. And I talked about this idea of kind of Islam as a category as being limiting, and how their positionalities and subjectivities are so kind of varied and different, depending on all their, on all these different kind of categories. So yeah, I think there's a real intention there of highlighting the lack of coherence, I suppose, here, and highlighting those silences, highlighting that chaos, and highlighting that radical potential. So I would really hope that far from obliterating it, or far from just kind of undergoing a process of what you call here liberal salvage, that we've tried to do, to be more careful than that, I suppose, in bringing together this collection. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. There's one last question from YouTube, the live stream. I'll just read it out. If we follow Derrida's logic of difference and the impossibility of fixed meaning, then what happens to the claim of reorienting when the text itself, fragmented, context bound, and slippery, refuses stable interpretation? Does the act of scholarly reorientation then become a violence of closure, a premature foreclosure of polysemic meanings in favor of academic coherence?
Can
Should
you
I
just read
repeat?
the last bit again? Sorry, it's hard to take all of that in when
That's
you're.
completely fine. If we follow Derrida's logic of difference and the impossibility of fixed meanings, then what happens to the claim of reorienting when the text itself, fragmented, context bound, and slippery, refuses stable interpretation? Does the act of scholarly reorientation then become a violence of closure, a premature foreclosure of polysemic meanings in favor of academic coherence?
I think, again, a really interesting question, and many of these are pointing to similar issues, aren't they? About trying to create coherence, trying to create a fixed archive, trying to create fixed meaning. And I really would question it. I've been trying to do that at all, I suppose. I think quite the opposite, actually. And I agree. These are things that, this question talked about kind of impossibility of fixed meaning. It talked about violences of closure. But is there closure here? I mean, I think quite the opposite. In a way, what we've tried to do with this collection is actually not close, but open up thinking about these issues and to open up the possibility of thinking about the lack of stability and the impossibility of fixed meaning, as was noted here. So I think I would question whether that was ever the intention, and therefore, because it wasn't, I don't think we've ever attempted to achieve that, and I would resist wanting to achieve that as well, I suppose. Yeah, for sure.
There's another question in the chat box. I'll just read it out. In this chat box, I'll just read it out. Is there a risk that the contemporary academic gaze, often located in
We had this one already, no?
I think this question has already been done. Yeah. Okay, so with this, we come to the end of today's session. Thank you so much, Professor, for this incredibly insightful lecture. And I think I speak for all of us when I say that I enjoyed this immensely. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Very big thank you to you, Radhika, and those of you who organized this series, but also to all of you who have asked these really important questions and really insightful and pushing questions, I suppose. So thank you for that. I appreciate that very much and give me lots to think about.
Have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.